So this 45th annual Langston Hughes Festival is really special because it coincides with a lot of other really special things that we wanted to celebrate this year. And I want to tell you a little bit about those things before I introduce all of these really good-looking people who are sitting over here. I don't know if you walked in on that side over there, but if you saw that newspaper over there that said fine and fabulous, when we did the walkthrough yesterday, a group of us decided that we're gonna do our photos next to the fine and fabulous one. So if you ever wanna do your photos, you should do it with that one over there. But I'm looking forward to introducing this group in just a little bit. But this year at CCNY is also the 55th anniversary of the Takeover. And if you're not familiar with the Takeover, I hope that you'll stick around at 2 o'clock when we do a streaming of the film, The Five Demands. And the Five Demands film tells the story of an amazing group of students who made 5 demands of this institution that demanded for better rights, for better diversity, for better curriculum, for a whole bunch of different things. And we'll learn a lot more about that at 2 o'clock if you stick around. But the 55th anniversary of that is this year. In addition, where is CCNY? Where are we located? Harlem. We are in Harlem, New York City. And I am from Memphis, Tennessee, and I'm a Southerner, unapologetically a Southerner. And I am also a Harlem Renaissance scholar. Zora Neale Hurston is what I worked on. And I know, I know that you don't get Harlem without the South, all right? You don't get Harlem without the Great Migration. You don't get Harlem without the South having something to say, without the South bringing people up. And so I wanted, as the first time being a part of the Langston Hughes Festival, I wanted to embed a little bit of the South in here as we were telling the story of Harlem, as we were telling the story of Colson's writing. If you think about Colson's writing, he's talking about this place. If you think about Harlem Shuffle, if you think about the narratives that he's crafting, he's telling the story of a people. And we wanted to celebrate Harlem. We wanted to celebrate City College. We wanted to celebrate all of Colson's amazing writings. We wanted to celebrate this place and space. We wanted to celebrate the students who were so incredibly brave as a part of the 55th anniversary of the Takeover. And those students not only demanded better from their institution, they also created some things. And one of the things that they created is what you see around you here. One of the things that they created was the paper. And the paper was a newspaper created by a group of multicultural students. And you see some large images of some of the pages of that newspaper in front of you. These pages can also be found in the archives of our library. And so we also are celebrating our library. We're celebrating research. We're celebrating academic pleasure. We're celebrating the opportunity to learn, to grow, to discover, and we hope that we'll inspire you with that today. So, with that, I'd like to introduce to you our panel. So, starting right here, to my left, we have Mr. Albert de Leon. Now, I'm just gonna give you a little brief synopsis, in essence, from my point of view, because you can read their full bios inside of the gorgeous program that you have in front of you. And this, of course, was designed by Mr. Kenneth Johnson, also an academic. So I hope you'll take a look there. But Mr. Albert de Leon is not only a brilliant litigator, but he was the second editor of the paper. So the second editor here, and he introduced me to the paper. When I first got here, I scheduled a meeting with him based off of the suggestion of Dee Dee, and he said, you need to know about the paper, because I told him that my bachelor's degree was in journalism, and I became fascinated. And in a lot of ways, he inspired this very concept today. Next, we have Mr. Greg Holder. And Mr. Holder was educated here in NYC, and I was introduced to him by Mr. Albert de Leon, and he was a former managing editor of the newspaper, and you will see some of his writings around here as well. That's one of the other cool things. Every single one of these papers that are chosen was chosen for a reason, because the paper is still in existence today. So you can imagine there were a lot of different ones to choose from. Next, you have Mr. Charles Powell, and Mr. Powell is serving a lot of different reasons on this panel today. Not only was he one of the 10 students who was a part of the 5 demands, he also was a contributing writer on the paper, and also a litigator as well. If you notice something, when you were part of demanding better rights here at this institution, you kind of went into what profession, do you notice? Law. Next, we have Rhiannon, and Rhiannon is the current student editor of the paper, and we wanted to connect the past and the present because we wanted you to also see that the paper is still in existence today, and so we wanted to have that as part of our conversation. Next, we have Barbara Nevins Taylor, and we know that our students would not be able to do the work that they do today without faculty advisors, and Barbara is the current faculty advisor for the paper, and we thank her for her service. And then, of course, we are here for the Langston Hughes Festival. And of course, if you are not familiar with Mr. Langston Hughes, we hope that you will read about him in the program. Langston Hughes, of course, was one of the leading Harlem Renaissance writers. He was a poet, he was a scholar, he was an essayist, he was a novelist, he was so many amazing things. And we have with us today Rich, and Rich and I go way back, actually. Rich is the president of the Langston Hughes Society, and the Langston Hughes Society is actually an allied organization with the College Language Association that I mentioned before, and they publish the Langston Hughes Review, one of the peer-reviewed academic journals that writes about Langston Hughes. And one of the things and one of the reasons why we wanted Rich here was to give us some context of bringing this all together. As you remember, I said we're weaving Langston and Colson and Harlem and the paper, all of these things together. And so before I turn it over to this illustrious panel, I want to turn your eyes to the quote behind us here. One of the reasons why we wanted to do this panel was because the paper had on its masthead a quote from Langston Hughes when it first came out. Now, most of you are probably familiar with the poem Harlem by Langston Hughes. And when you think of the poem Harlem, you probably think of what happens to a dream deferred, right? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Well, as Rich and I were laughing about the other day, Hughes could get a little lazy sometimes. I can say that as a Harlem Renaissance scholar. Rich and I decided on this. And he would use the same title for poems. So he has another poem entitled, what? Harlem. And does it say what happens to a dream deferred? No. It's Harlem 1949. And it's what was in the masthead of the paper. And it says, here on the edge of Harlem, of hell, stands Harlem, remembering the old lies, the old kicks in the back, the old be patient they told us before. Sure, we remember now when the man at the corner store says sugar's gone up another 2 cents and bread 1 and there's a new tax on cigarettes. We remember the job we never had, never could get, and can't have now because we're colored. So we stand here on the edge of hell in Harlem and look out on the world and wonder what we're gonna do in the face of what we remember. I give you your paper panel.
It's hard to follow this wonderful introduction. What I find interesting, is it on? Is the last verse was written in 1949, It certainly applied in 1970 when the paper was created by Paul Sims, Francie Covington, and Louis Rivera. Francie is still with us. She's out in San Francisco. And I think that last stanza could also apply today. Still with us. I got involved in the paper kind of by accident. It was in the spring of 1970, and I was just getting out of a political science class. And some of the students were saying, did you see that new paper called The Paper? And how the arrogance of those people calling the newspaper The Paper. And for whatever reason, I said, I got to be there. So I walked from the class to the office, which was at Findlay, and joined the paper. A year later, I became co-editor with Judon Ford. He and his wife, Arlette Heck, which you'll see on some of the bylines, are living in Las Vegas. So there was a lot to do, and one of the things that stands out with me, and I'm going to ask Greg and Charles to put in their memories, is what we did. And one of the things that really stands out, and Jervette mentioned that we were multicultural, and while it started out as sort of a black newspaper, it really wasn't. We did have whites on the staff. And Greg, I'd like for you at some point to tell a story about David and OP. We did a lot of things, and I mentioned David Friedlander, who was one of the outstanding writers we had. David wrote a story on the real story of Attica prison uprising, and we broke that story before the New York Times. Those are the kinds of things we were doing. Looking at drugs, looking at the Sikh program, looking at open admissions. Yeah, maybe in the last of the paper we might have covered, yes, the Beavers won last night. But we had other articles. We had, I remember one by one of the sociology professors who did a spread on drugs. And at the time we were in school, in the early 70s, late 60s, heroin was an epidemic in Harlem. You couldn't walk the streets without seeing somebody nodding out on the effects of heroin. And he just traced what people are doing now with fentanyl, how it got into the country, how it got into the community. So also we had, and Rhiannon might be envious of this, we had about 30 people on staff. And we didn't have dormitories, so the office was sort of a hangout place. And those who wanted to be journalists would sometimes hang out there. But everybody contributed, from the photographers, we had a great photography staff, writers, editors. In fact, I don't see her, but she said she would come. The head of our business department just retired as a Court of Claims judge in New York City. And that was business. She just made sure the bills match. And we'd have to go out and get ads. We got a little money, kind of a pittance from the college, but we would get these ads so that we could publish up to a 24-page paper every week. We like to talk about going down to the West Village, the Borough Printer, and getting the paper out. And the printers knew as much about grammar and English as we did. And they weren't college educated, but they were doing that kind of work. Not to say that once we stopped, there was a great Cuban restaurant down there that served very good food, so we could eat on the way back. But it was an exciting time. One of the things I want to thank the archivist, Sidney Van Noort. You mentioned archive. I didn't know the college archived all of the newspapers until I spoke with her. But she helped us get the paper digitized. So you can go online and look up and see all of these papers because we felt, because it was a groundbreaking newspaper and something we didn't realize at the time. We realized it in 2007 when we had our reunion, but we didn't realize how good we were in what we covered. and we think we have probably one of the best college newspapers in the country. So, Charles, Greg.
To kind of pick up on what Al said, in terms of the effort that went into publishing the paper, you have to remember there were no computers then. So we had to write our articles. Most of us wrote it by hand. Some were able to type. And then those who wrote it by hand, it had to be put into type. And then we had to lay it out manually, construction paper, cutting out articles.
Grammatically correct.
And it had to be grammatically correct. And we had to lay it out, and then take the layouts down to the printer for the printer to put it into type settings. And then we had to wait for the issues to be printed. Then we had to take the issues and bring them up to campus and distribute it around campus. And then eventually, we started distributing it to other campuses around the city. And at one point, I could say, because I was doing a lot of the distribution, it was being distributed to every campus in the city university, with the singular exception of John Jay. In addition to the city university campuses, it was also being distributed at Adelphi, at Hofstra, at SUNY Westbury, at SUNY Purchase. And then some of our friends were taking it to other campuses or giving it to their friends who were attending campuses out of the city. So there were students who were getting this paper all up and down the East Coast. And for that to be done by a student newspaper was amazing. And as Al mentioned, we were publishing, some of our issues were 24 pages, and we were publishing on a weekly basis at one point about 16,000 copies per issue. And I think we did one issue that went up to 24,000. And this was all paid for by the advertising that we were able to generate. And that was groundbreaking for a student newspaper to get advertising and to bring in its own advertising and to be able to publish a paper with the depth that we did and with the amount of copies that we did. And when we did this, we didn't even begin to think about going to the student government and asking them for more money. Al mentioned the pittance. I think it was $200 or something. And when we decided that we were going to expand our publication and expand the number of issues that we were printing, we just figured out we had to find the money somewhere. And so again, we were fortunate. We had a couple of people who had business minds. I remember Bill Ballinger came in and said, hey, we can get ads. And that's what we did. When even the change of the name, and no disrespect to the current faculty advisor, but we were talking among ourselves while we were waiting to come in here. Well, I don't ever remember our meeting our faculty advisor. I knew we had one, but we never got any advice.
Well, the legacy lives on.
Yes. But even the changing of the name, we were talking about it earlier. And I came over to the paper from Utambuzi. And Utambuzi was a student newsletter that was put out by the Black and Puerto Rican Student Union. Because at the time when I first came to the city in '68, you had 3 newspapers that served the daytime student population: the Campus, Observation Post, and Tech News. None of them addressed any issues of concern to the Black and Puerto Rican students on campus. And so BPR, initially we were part of the Onyx Society, and then within the Onyx Society we went to the student government and demanded that we get some money to be able to publish a newsletter. So we used to, again, starting out by handwriting and then mimeographing copies and stapling them together. We put together this newsletter for the Black and Puerto Rican student community called Utambuzi. And we did that for almost 2 years. And then when Utambuzi began to kind of fold it, Louis and Paul invited some of the writers and editors from Utambuzi to come over and join them at Tech News. And so I came over with Jerry Mondesire and some others, and we joined Tech News. And then one day, came into the office. That was usually my first stop on campus. And Louis Rivera calls me over. He said, hey, I want to run something past you. I said, okay, what's up? I'm thinking about changing the name. I said, okay, cool. What do you want to change it to? He says, well, you know, this Tech News, we're not about tech news or engineering anymore. So we got to come up with another name. So Louis and I kicked around a few ideas. And finally I said, what about the paper? And he said, the paper? I said, yeah, because we're the only paper on campus that's worth anything. So we are the paper. So Louis said, I like that. And so we changed the name. And I had forgotten that for one or two issues, it was the paper, parentheses, AKA Tech News, to kind of smooth over the transition. But that was just something we decided to do. Paul came up with the quote from Langston Hughes that became part of our masthead. And then one day Louis said, I want to print in color. I said, okay, what colors do you want to use? How about red, black, and green? Cool. So we started printing in red, black, and green. And we didn't ask anybody for permission or any guidance. These were just things we did. And the stories that we wrote reflected our interest in what was going on in the world. And I'd say, for one, for me, the paper, it gave me some lasting, lifelong friendships, you know. And it also was a safe space for us, you know, where we could come, we debated among ourselves, we argued among ourselves and had really intense arguments and debates. But it was a place where we felt free to come and be who we were and to talk about and write about the things that we were interested in. And finally, it was a place where it allowed us to explore those things that we were interested in. So you'll see articles in the paper about the Black Panthers, about the Schomburg Institute, about things going on in campus, about things going on around the city, because these were the things that were affecting us as students, and these were the things that interested us.
And just to put it in perspective, we were in school during the Vietnam War, civil rights, Cambodia. I think, Charles, you went down south on some demonstrations, but you talk about that. But there was a lot going on. We had our photographers went around campus one time taking pictures of all the FBI agents who were on campus. And you could always tell them because they didn't have long hair like we did, or big afros. So they really stood out.
You had a big afro?
Someone said I had the biggest one on campus.
Really? I want that picture.
I probably had the shortest hair.
Yeah, the shortest one?
Because my haircut is just about like it is now.
Not as great.
Pictures, there's lots of pictures left in the newspaper room. I'm going to look through, because I found Albert, I found Francie, I found Louis. I found all of them, like, over the last, like, period of months. Like, we just go through the photos sometimes. I'm like, oh, I know this person. Every once in a while.
So, Rhiannon, I hear Instagram slideshows coming from the paper?
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
Coming soon.
Coming soon?
Our vice president's here, and he's, like, making notes. I can see it turning in his brain right now.
So, hairstyles from the paper.
Just to get a preview of the 5 demands, the very first shot that they show is a staff picture. Mm-hmm. So Charles is in that, I'm in it, in the back with an afro.
I made the pick.
I'm at the bottom, down in the front. With
Sunglasses.
sunglasses and a hat.
I think that's the picture on page, is that the one on page 7? Is that one?
No. That's
Is it a different one?
yeah.
So if you go to the 5 Demands website, though, you should be able to see the other pictures of it.
Or even look at the trailer.
Yeah, or look at the trailer. But that image is similar to the one. Mr. Powell?
Oh, so thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm just going to tell a couple of quick stories, but before I do that, I want to give an acknowledgement. I think it's so valuable that we are able to even have this conversation. We have a preservationist that's sitting here at the table with us, and as well as one, I know this mic may not be on. I'm projecting. So, and we have, you know, may not have a talk back today, but I did not want to, I would be remiss if we didn't honor Andrea Weiss and Greta Schiller for the work that they've done on the 5 demands. Al has kept us together 50 some odd years. I mean, he's the convener. He's the one who sends out the emails. It was his idea for us to form a scholarship fund that we've been able to endow. And so I believe that we need to give people their flowers and their honors while we're still here. So I want to just acknowledge my brother. Andrea and Greta has heard me tell this story to President Boudreaux. Jervette has also heard the same story. Francie Covington, 1970, she got the Townsend Harris Medal. And then Al was, I believe you were 72, a grad, right? Were you 72? And you got the medal, but they missed me. I was 1971. So there's some catch up that we'll have to do.
One of our key staffers at the time was Sekou Sandiata. And Sekou won the Langston Hughes Medal in 2003.
So yeah, I mean, we have illustrious. I mean, Al's going to do it. If he doesn't, I want to just acknowledge, you know, those who have gone on. We call them our ancestors. A few of them, you know, really have left an indelible mark on me and even in my professional career. Greg talked about it. Not only did we come together and we had family and we had each other, and that was so significant and important. Don't forget, we had the 5 demands, but that didn't change the population of the college overnight. So we just had each other. We had those families, and the paper was a family, and it was our sanctuary. It was for me. Now, I was one of the student leaders, and so there was still a whole lot of mess going on with me, but when I walked into the paper office, Paul and Louis and Francie, you know Francie, said, you may have been the boss over there, but you ain't the boss over here. You know, so you're coming here to contribute and to learn, and I did. I went to law school. I was only there for that last year, you know, because I graduated in '71. But boy, did I learn things. Louis Reyes Rivera would take, as Greg said, whatever you typed it out or hand wrote it, and he would do the red line and the red and the corrections and doing whatever. So by the time I got to law school, they were asking me, how did you become such a good writer? Because I did pretty well in law school. You know, I actually wrote for the Law Review and I was one of the first African-American students at the University of Illinois College of Law, and I attribute that to Paul and Louis and the others who taught us the value of the written word. We wrote with purpose, we wrote with passion, we wrote with intentionality. And that's the beauty of that training that came forth. So I am eternally grateful to those brothers and sisters who taught me how to write. I'm a pretty good writer, you know. But the fact of the matter is, you know, this legacy, again, needs to be preserved. We are grateful. We have reached back, and we continue to reach back, and we will continue to those who have maintained this paper, the paper. And so we're grateful to have, you know, our editor here, you know, with us. But we ask you to remember, as Langston Hughes said, what we have been up against in order to even be able to say that we're still here. We were endangered species then, and we are endangered species again. You know, so let's celebrate, but let's be vigilant, let's be mindful, let's be aware, you know, that one of the other phrases that we learned back in the paper, we could have put that onto the masthead. A luta continua, the struggle continues. That is who we are, and that is what we will do. So we pass that on to you, my dear.
Well, I am extremely grateful for the legacies that we have here. They have held the paper together in more ways than probably they understand. You know, my friends from the paper who are here right now, you guys know what it is like trying to pick back up a student newspaper in a post-COVID, half online, half in-person world, especially with all the changes that happened to students and to staff. it's a very different time, and I can't even, we talk about this all the time, we read your papers that you guys put out once a week, and you didn't have laptops to send this stuff in, you had to go down yourself, and we're sitting here like, how do we get, an online paper to, become something closer to what it used to be? And I think that one of the conversations I had that was really influential in the beginning of me taking over the paper was actually with Professor Nevins Taylor, our advisor, was about the quality of the writing. We had articles that were coming out, and people were writing about what they were interested in, but there wasn't really a lot of guidance when it came to the actual writing and the editing of the paper. And as much as most people in college know, being on a student newspaper, it looks good. You learn for good reason. You learn a lot of really important skills, like you were talking, and my dad went to law school, and ever since then, he's like, the most important thing you can be is a good writer. So, whether I wanted to or not, I took that to heart. But I think one thing that was really important for me when going into the paper was really showing the students who had an interest that they were capable of producing high quality writing. And we had to make decisions, especially when we're dealing with smaller staffs and more people than ever that are taking online classes, not even coming in person. And we have like a couple writers who just went to study abroad. So they're doing a semester in a different country right now. And we're gonna try to work with them from abroad and see if they can still write for us. And navigating all those challenges is really difficult. But I think that what we always come back to is, the old archival photos, the old archival newspapers. Like having a physical copy, seeing what people who were in our shoes were doing at one point with, even bigger challenges than we have now is, I think, a really inspiring way to keep pushing forward. And it's why even when we have things like a global pandemic shut down the entire campus and the school, the paper will pick back up. When I started here, Barbara Nevins Taylor immediately recommended that I join the paper. And there's another newspaper on campus, The Campus, so clearly our names have, a kind of theme to them, I guess. But she told me, look into the paper, look into The Campus, and immediately looking into the paper, I found Albert's article that he wrote, The Legacy, about the history of it, where it started. And I think that quote that was at the masthead, and especially the last 3 lines, what we're gonna do in the face of what we remember, is such an important one for this paper, where it was then and where it is now. We talk about like the things that they've lived through that we are now still reading about. Like the Attica prison riot, I probably wouldn't have read the actual story if it weren't for the paper publishing it. I found it that way and I got to read it that way. So, and I think it's also about what we as individuals remember, what we experience and live through, and showing the students here that your story that you have to tell is important and it is valuable and it is part of modern history, whether or not you realize that right now. So, great job on the quote choice. I highly recommend. And as soon as we get to printing, it'll be back up there on the masthead, guaranteed.
Thank you, Rhiannon. So, I hope that everybody's hearing the same thing I hear. I'm hearing a story about memory and history and the love of a campus activity at the City College of New York. That is so important. Having a place to take your ideas, to meet with people who are like you, who think like you, who want to speak and write like you, is incredibly important. Having the power of journalism is incredibly important. And that's what the students of 1968 to 1973 learned. They learned the power of journalism. They didn't go on to become journalists, but they took what we taught, what I learned here, what we teach now with them. And I hope that Rhiannon will do that in the future. And others on the staff of the paper will take whatever you get from it and apply it to your life. But of course, the writing, for me, is the critical thing, is the most important. I want to say that there is one person on this panel who deserves so much credit for bringing the paper back to life. That's Al De Leon. Al, the paper would not exist in the form it does today had it not been for Al. Al started before the pandemic and he came around and he talked to Linda Villarosa, who was the journalism program director then, and he talked to me, and he talked about the importance of memory, the importance of the legacy of the paper, and he tried to revive it. It had sputtered, it started, it stopped, but Al persisted, and finally he got a good editor, and she held on through the pandemic, and then the paper found Rhiannon. And I think it has really exploded, wouldn't you say?
Also, if we could just quickly, Ryan and Chuck,
why don't we
just stand really
acknowledge
quickly.
the
This
current
is our
paper
vice president
people.
and managing editor of the paper. I would not be able to do any of this without them. They were here my first semester starting. You know, Barbara knows all this, and so does Albert. But there was a lot of craziness and chaos that, you know, resulted in me ending up in editor-in-chief when I did. It was a responsibility I was definitely not prepared for, but was very excited about and willing to make work. And I think if I've learned anything from the journalism program at this school and from the people who are, you know, sitting right next to me, is what really like matters if you want not only a career in journalism, but to make a difference, to tell a story, is that you just go out there and do it. You know, at the end of the day, you just have to give it a shot, and if she puts your corrections on front of the board for the entire class to pull through, then you'll be better for it, as I definitely was.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. But Al, you really deserve to be part of everybody in this room and more. Thank you.
I'd like to say a couple of words. One, I got the support of my colleagues, Greg and Arlette and Judon and Paul Sims when he was alive. They supported this. They worked with us on the committee to establish the scholarship. And it really started in 2005 when we had a reunion here on campus. And some of us hadn't seen each other in a long time. And that brought folks together, including Louis and Paul, who are now deceased, and Sekou. And they supported this effort. And a shout out to Cindy Van Noort, who worked with us on digitizing the paper. And also, you hear these stories about we cranked it out 24 pages a week or so of back and forth to the printer, dropping the copies off. We had to study also.
Yeah, we were in school.
Some of us did.
But we had to study in addition to doing other things. I played baseball on the team. So there was a lot of other things going on at the time. So it wasn't easy, but glad to see Rhiannon and those in the bleacher seats up there carry on.
Thank you so
Don't be
much.
there for Rich.
Rich, I really appreciate you coming, especially as we're thinking about the fact that, one, this is the Langston Hughes Festival, and then, of course, that these students chose this Langston Hughes quote for their masthead, the cover of the newspaper. And I really was hoping that you would share a little bit, of course, about Langston Hughes, but also maybe your thoughts about what is it about Langston Hughes that inspires people in such a way that, one, in the 1970s, a group of students would choose to put a quote from him in their masthead, and then still, even here in 2024, we're still talking about him. We're still choosing his words for events, for festivals, to give out medals to people like Colson, Whitehead. Like, what is it? You're choosing to give your time to be the president of the Langston Hughes Society. Like, why? Why Hughes?
That's a great question. So I'm the odd person here. I don't have a connection to CCNY or the paper, but I am the president of Langston Hughes Society. I was just elected in the fall. I've been a secretary for several years, so I've been involved with the organization for quite some time. I think one of the things that Langston Hughes does for people is he's got a little bit for everyone in terms, he's got humor in a lot of his poetry, and he has anger in a lot of his poetry, and he's also very good at mixing humor and anger. He's very good at making very pointed arguments with laughter, right? And the simple stories, for instance, are a great example of this. These short stories that he wrote for the Chicago Defender, a lot of them appeared in the Chicago Defender, and they were humorous, and so people would read them because they were funny, but they often made a point about segregation or about other forms of government discrimination, and so he was able to get across those points about social issues without, well, let's put it this way. Towards the end of his career, he was very kind to younger writers, and he was very kind to a young writer named Amiri Baraka, who was not exactly as kind back to him in terms of, because Hughes was not as, he was not as confrontational in that way. But he was always very solid in his beliefs. And I think that, a poem like Harlem, both of the poems like Harlem, show us how he can represent the pain and the anger, right, and leave it open to some kind of future that leaves that door open. I think that one of the things that often gets quoted from Hughes these days anymore is I too, right? The I too sing America, which he then closes with I too am America, right? And it's sort of a family metaphor of, I am the darker brother, right? And it's a family metaphor of gaining equality, but the gaining of equality comes through strength, right? And there's, he says, I'll eat in the kitchen, sure, send me to the kitchen and I'll eat there, but I'm going to get stronger. And then no one will dare to tell me not to eat at the table, right? No one will dare to send me to the kitchen when company comes. And so there's this idea of, for Hughes, even in that quiet resistance, if you will, there's an idea that tomorrow there's going to be a change, there's going to be a difference, and I think that that's something that people can take with them.
So one of the things you're reminding me of is when you look at this poem and you really are telling our story, because remember, we were the ones looking out, over our homes. That you're going to see a lot of that in the 5 demands. But don't forget that when you think of our connection with Langston Hughes, you have to be reminded that, at least for me, I didn't study in Cohen. I went down the hill and I studied in the Schomburg, and that was with Arturo Schomburg. And when you walked into that particular library, the old building, not the new one, you could hear a pin drop. There was a reverence. Don't ever forget, as the film shows, who we had here on campus, the great literary giants, that were here in that seat program. The Tony K, Babamara, and the others, who were there, so they kept us connected. So we were not in any way dealing with this, let's say the masthead quote, in an isolated fashion. It symbolized exactly what we would do. We would stand here on St. Nicholas Terrace, where you're going to see from the film where a couple of battles occurred, physical battles, with respect to the 5 demands, and look out over, and wonder, where are we going in light of what we remember, and also John Henrik Clark and, Dr. Ben Yohanan, they were all here. They were our mentors, you're going to see again, I'm just giving previews at, Andrea, about the film, but you're going to see, people in that film who were here with us on campus, and that was critical to our individual and collective development.
And if I could just add, one of the things to keep in mind is that the overall context of the social context in which all of this takes place. This was the civil rights era. This was the anti-Vietnam era. This was the era of rent strikes in Harlem.
Right.
I walked on a picket line when I was 12 years old out in Jamaica, demonstrating for black workers to get the right to work as laborers in the building of Rochdale Village. So most of us came to the campus. I came on campus in September '68. As we came onto campus, we brought with us, many of us brought with us the experiences that we had already had.
Sure.
In the social context in which we grew up. And all of that came together, and so the evolution of the 5 demands which you'll see in the film, and the evolution of the paper was all part of a larger context.
That's right.
You know, and we, in many ways, we benefited from that context. You know, it helped to shape us, and it helped to, at the same time, motivate us and propel us. And we also drew out of it, you know, inspiration. I'd like to point out that many, to my knowledge, most of our colleagues on the paper, when we left school, we not only went to pursue careers, but many of us, like Charles and Al, Greg Harmon, who's passed away, Jerry Mondazai, who went down to Philly and became an editor of a major newspaper in Philadelphia, worked for a congressman. We took with us that same spirit, you know, and tried to infuse that spirit in the things that we were doing in our adult lives.
Thank you for sharing that. One of the things that I hear from you is the uniqueness of the space, of how Harlem made the paper unique, of being in this space and this place. I worked on the student newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee, and I think about how Memphis shaped my experience. And I think about even how Memphis shows up in the Five Demands film, as you think about how the assassination of King influenced you at that time. As we move towards our last few minutes before we open up this time for you to ask questions, because we want to save some time for you to be able to engage, and we have the microphones here, so you can start formulating and thinking about some of the questions you might want to ask the panel. As you see around here, we have some of the pages from the paper. So we have one of the articles from both from Charles, from Greg, from Al, but what were some of your favorite stories to cover? What were some of the stories that you most remember? And Rhiannon as well, what are some of the stories that you've enjoyed writing about? Share that with us.
I'll go. One of the stories I remember doing was at a elementary school in Harlem. And again, as I mentioned, heroin was an epidemic in Harlem at the time. And just wondering how these small kids could learn in that kind of an environment. And that really resonated with me and still does. Greg?
I remember writing a story about the flooding of Bangladesh. Wow. There was, I guess, a tsunami. And Bangladesh is basically almost entirely at sea level. And almost the entire country was flooded. And they were having a hard time, of course, getting in relief supplies. Thousands of people died. And it was something that just interested me. And so I gathered as much information as I could from other sources, from the newspapers and TV, and I wrote a story about it that, if I remember correctly, it was a centerpiece.
The centerpieces that we used to do.
Oh,
the
yeah.
Layouts.
The centerfold was like the special part of the paper. Mm-hmm. And the stories that went on the centerfold were always big stories.
Major stuff.
And the other thing about the paper I remember that I liked was the personal ads. If you look at the archives of the paper, you'll see a lot of stuff in the personal ads which are things about other people on campus. And that was something that we just kind of started. And it was our way of ribbing each other and teasing one another, teasing some of our friends on campus. One of the brothers, Dwayne Watts, he was the road runner. But
his initials were ROC, Romeo on campus.
You're trying to get people to go to the archives, aren't you?
Judon Ford at the time. Because the other thing was that many of us also had jobs. In addition to going to school,
right.
We also had jobs. So Judon Ford worked part-time for a towing company that did, towed cars on the road. And we would always joking with Judon, because Judon was also very strong, very built brother, and we would always joke with him about not needing the tow truck. But the personal ads was just another feature of the paper. And the funny thing was is that people on campus started picking up on it. And then people on campus started asking us, well, what was this about? What was that reference to? And then some people were actually picking up the paper just to read the personnel ads.
So my favorite, just wanted to add, that's why I asked about the centerfold. And by the way, there would be, you think it was easy, the number of debates that took place all day long and all night long editorially. I don't know what you guys are going through currently, but they were literally battles over photos, over text. My favorite was, we were always trying to stay relevant to our stories. So for example, if you remember 1970, everyone was talking about Kent State, but no one was really talking about Jackson State. You know, so we did a centerpiece where we did a juxtaposition of Kent State and Jackson State, you know, just to show the disparity. And it was headed up, you know, about, you know, and that's why, you know, we were head of the game. We were still calling out, and we were saying their lives matter too. That was the heading, you know, of it. So that's kind of like the precursor to the Black Lives Matter, you know, yeah, they matter. You know, so no one cared, and that's why we would go to those stories. And by the way, we were on the ground in those stories. So as Al and Greg was saying, we weren't just writing about that, we were physically present. We would go and talk to, you know, the people. So we did at least have telephones. We didn't, you know, we didn't have the fax machines and doing whatever, but we could call friends and we'd get in cars. And then as we said, that's why a number of us got on those buses in 1970, and we spent the entire November election period working for, you know, a black party in Alabama, where we went all the way from Huntsville, Alabama, all the way down to Mobile, Alabama, and we were able to get historically assisted with the first elections of sheriffs. And if you know anything, you know about the South, the most powerful person is not the mayor, not the head of the city council, is the sheriff. And we got black sheriffs in Lowndes County and a number of other counties, so that's something that we covered. And we would be giving information. So that was the things that I remember. We did cutting edge things because we wanted to tell stories of what you could not read, sometimes even in the Amsterdam News, or Jet, or, you know, Ebony, or whatever. We would be telling those stories.
Some of our colleagues went down to Cuba with the December Brigade.
That is true.
To help with the harvest. And so those were the kinds of things that we covered. You know, that nobody else was covering. You know, Guyana, what happened in Guyana with Georgetown.
An interesting story, if I may, is one of the writers for the paper, Ann Doris, is from Guyana. She went down on the trip when she was working for the paper. She now teaches at Penn State and took some of her students to Guyana. And this was 50 years later. So, and one of the things is, before I forget, we all have great memories of City College. There was no dormitory, so the only time we saw each other was in the office, or we might go to a party, and that would be it. But we have this project I call the Reflections Project. And I've asked everybody who's associated with the paper to write about what City College meant to them and what the paper meant to them. And have about 40 responses. And we published some of them in City Beat, and I think the Alumni Magazine published one. And we have some others that we want to publish, including Greg's and Charles, hopefully to raise some money for the scholarship fund. So I put that out there as a plug for that. The scholarship fund. The paper scholarship fund for social justice.
Page 7.
Amen.
The QR code.
What was that, Jervette?
The QR code.
The QR code. Scholarship.
Rhiannon?
So I mean, obviously, I could honestly probably pick out stories that are my favorite from the archives. I've read so many of them. But I, unfortunately, have not gotten to write for the paper since I took over as editor because so much work to be done there. And, you know, the job of editor is, as I'm sure my professor can tell everyone, is tedious and lengthy. But I really enjoyed doing that. Honestly, my favorite article that I've written for the paper was my article covering Francie Covington and her Townsend Harris award. The reason I think that was my favorite was because this award ceremony came up and she was so kind to invite me, and Albert was very great to introduce me. But this came up just about at the same time that I was being in talk for the next editor-in-chief, which, as I kind of hinted to, came out of nowhere. So, you know, I really wasn't sure what I was agreeing to, and I wasn't really sure, like, what that would look like realistically. And when I got to go to the Alumni Association, first of all, I met so many people who were in some way affiliated with the paper at their time at City College. And every single one of them had something wonderful to say about their experience with it. And I really wanted to make sure that while I was here and I had like the passion for it and the ability to help it stay something that is a part of City College's future and not just its past, was really important for me. In talking to Francie and getting to hear all of her stories. I sat next to her best friend, who had plenty of stories to tell me about her and her days back when she was on the paper. It was just a really inspirational experience for me, and writing that article really reminded me, like, one day, you know, God willing, people will be writing articles like this about our writers that are here right now. And I think seeing for our students that, you know, in the future, 50 years from now, you can come back and this will still be something that preserves who you were now and like who you're going to be is a really important thing. I don't think you can take that away. And even if it only lives in a City College newspaper, it's part of the record. It's part of something that researchers in the future will look back on. I do a lot of research myself, and I have come across all kinds of interesting sources from small newspapers, small magazines you would never think would come up again 50, 100 years later, and they do. And they become important to like the stories we tell in the future and who our future generations are.
Thank you so much. So, questions from the audience. You've had a couple minutes now to gather your thoughts. I gave you a heads up. What would you like to ask this panel? We have a couple microphones down here, and Mr. Gregg is right here holding one. What would you like to ask? Don't all rush up at once. All right, the provost is going to take the lead.
I'm just going to try and warm people up.
Okay.
So first of all, thank you for this. It's been fascinating and fun and really informative. Since you talked about your favorite things, I wanted to ask this slightly different question, sort of a two-part question. First of all, what was and what is the process for deciding what gets published? Is it the editor who's the final word, or was it, you know, Charles referred to, you know, brawls and fights and so forth? But the second part of it is, what's something that didn't get published that you really thought should have?
There were arguments, debates. Rhiannon is right about being an editor. You don't write as much. One of my most memorable was the debate I had with David Friedlander on the Attica story.
Which is back here. The Attica one is back right there.
Yeah, but you have to go into the book to see his story.
Yeah.
And we debated that almost all afternoon. I wanted to cut it because that's what editors do. You shorten things. And we went back and forth on that. And I'm not ashamed to say that I lost. He was very persuasive. And if you ever look at and read the story, you'll see why.
I can say first of all, it's definitely the editor that makes the decision. That was
Yeah.
one thing I was like, if I'm doing all the editing, I am also making sure that everything, and I think that's the job, you know, like the students are coming here, we're all learning, even I'm learning as I'm doing this. And the same was true for all of these people when they were on the paper. They were also learning how to do the job on the job. So I feel like my approach is to really work with the writers as much as possible. I think based on the position that the paper's in now, is I have not been in a position to not be able to publish an article that I think was really good and was there. But there have been multiple situations in which I've had to say, you know, this story is good in theory, but it's you haven't either reported the story fully, the facts are not there, the interviews are not there, the writing is not there, and it's very difficult to say these things to your peers who you respect and you want them to respect you as well. But it's because you respect them that you will tell them the truth. And I've had plenty of people tell me the truth, you know, and it is a little bit daunting in the beginning when you're like, oh, that's a lot of red marks on my paper. My first article I submitted to her, I was like, got this. And then I get the article back, I was like, I've never seen so much red on a Google Doc before. But ultimately, I got so much better for it and so much better, much faster. I've had so many wonderful opportunities, both at this campus and outside of it, because I had people willing to tell me, no, this isn't ready. So I think, like, you know, one of the things I do remember, though, is we recently published a story on a protest that happened at a president's town hall over the current conflict in Israel and Palestine. And that was an article that we had a lot of conversations about. I think actually it was, you know, reporting and editing that article was the time that most reminded me of what you guys describe about your experience, because we had a lot of opinions flying from every side of this like 10-person table. Every single writer was there, and we had a group Google Doc that we were writing notes in. And ultimately, a lot of what we said didn't even end up in the story because it wasn't relevant to the story itself. But I think the fact that we had those conversations, you know, and even if not everything ended up in it, everyone got to have their voice heard, and we really did have a real like dialogue about it. You know, even though I ultimately made the decision of what's in and what's out, because at some point somebody's got to, you know, it was really a thing of like, I learned from everybody who was at the table. And I think I have from every article that's both been published and not, you know. Sometimes being a good journalist is knowing when to let a story go. I've learned that the hard way because I like to, you know, hold on for dear life, but I've learned just as much from the times I let go of it too.
You know, the editor made kind of the final decision, but I'd be remiss in not saying that Louis Rivera, one of the founders, previously worked as an editor with the Associated Press. So he brought real life stories, but also professional work to the paper, which is why, as Greg said, we didn't know our faculty advisor because we didn't need our faculty advisor. And I think, you know, New York high schools might have been better back then than they are now. So a lot of folks did well in school. So there were decisions that were made kind of in a group. And we kind of knew what was important, what was not, but also to give the writers the latitude to pick subjects that they were interested in. And a lot of it tied in with the struggles, as it were, that we were going through as a people here in the U.S.
But to be transparent with what you were asking about, there were definitely articles that we wanted, condemnations, for example, of the administration. We were cautioned not to do, calling out certain elected officials, statewide and citywide. We were cautioned, you know, to be careful, you know, about that. So that's why, as Al said, you know, Louis and Paul were, you know, also gatekeepers. They were protectors, you know, because we were ready just to put stuff out there, you know, that people would have sued us for libel and slander, you know, and say things and slander, you know. So we learned,
well,
you know, that there's
lawyers.
Yeah, that we learned that, right, you know, that there were certain limits, you know, to, you know, publishing things that, you know, you may have written at a given night because you were angry about things. So, for example, many of us were very angry about what was going on at NAC. There was an entity, you know, and you did that struggle out at Rochdale, but, you know, we were out there with, you know, there was a group called Harlem Fight Back, and they were, you know, protesting, you know, their lack of minority engagement. Today, that's a routine thing, you know, to see, but back in those days, they weren't sensitive to that, you know. So we called, you know, we were ready to call out people, you know, who's being paid off, you know, doing whatever. And they said, no, you can't write stuff like that. You know, that you have to, you know, handle, you know, differently. So it was that kind of protective, you know, guard that we learned you had to have in journalism, that you just can't say anything you wish to say.
And you remind me of, I think I mentioned Utem Luzi earlier. And I think one of the things that happened with Utem Luzi that led to his folding was the student government pulled our funding.
Yeah,
Because
things like
we
that.
wrote a couple of articles that they didn't like.
Right.
Including stories about what the student government was doing and not doing. And so they pulled our funding, and so we couldn't publish as Utambuzi any longer. And fortunately, Paul and Louis were in a position to invite us to come in.
Mhm.
But we still publish controversial issues.
Yeah.
Open admissions, the SEEK program.
SEEK program.
And even, and I think it's kind of a testament, there were very few blacks and Latinos on campus when we were here. Now I think it is, and you all can correct me, I think at least a third of the students at City are Latino, a third maybe South Asian, and then blacks and whites pull up the rear, which was kind of odd if you look back 50 years.
Thank you. I think there was a question over here. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. I'm just so happy to be here. I'm Missy Watson. I'm in the English department. I'm also the director of the first year of writing program. And I'm just so grateful for this very special history that I got to learn so much more about today. And I'm thinking about this quote. I'm thinking about all that we have to remember. And I'm thinking about just how much there is to remember. The history you're sharing, but just everything that's going on in the world that continues to go on today. And just from a journalist perspective, I'm really curious. I'd love to hear you talk about how you balance covering what is now and new and important, but also helping all of us to not forget all of that is there for us to remember. And so I would just love to hear that balance, what you
Sounds like
do.
a Rhiannon question.
I was gonna say, I love this question personally because my favorite thing in the world to say is that no story exists in a void. Now, I have as I mentioned, my first article I submitted to her, lots of red marks. And part of the reason is because I love the history behind everything. So when I read a story, like often that'll prompt me to look into the full history behind the laws and all of that. So for me, like that was a really hard thing to manage, especially because I come from a literature background. So I'm used to writing, the historical analysis, research papers, and coming to journalism from that experience. I think it was really difficult at first because it's really hard to say what is this story and what is just something that surrounds it, where you draw the line, it matters a lot too, because the one detail you choose to include or not include can make a huge difference in not only how a story is received, but how it's responded to by the people who are actively at play in it. I think for me, one thing that I really like to do is try to think about every single character. Obviously they're real people, they're not characters. We have this conversation in journalism all the time. But, trying to think about it from every single person I interview's perspective, whether I agree with their perspective or can understand it at all or not, it's my job to try to make sure that everybody who's represented in a story is fully represented, not just as a piece of dialogue, but as a person. And that's why I think it is actually helpful to think about them as characters because, you're in English, so you understand too. When you're talking about characters, you want round characters, characters that have dimensions and motivations, because that's what's real. It's not real to say that somebody did this bad thing, then they said this bad thing, and that was that, It's not to say that there's a justification or an explanation, but it came from somewhere, and where that came from is part of the story a lot of the time. So I think there's not one right answer. I think, it also depends on what your word count is, where you're writing for. I've written for places that love the history. I've written for places that really don't want any of it. So I think it really depends on who you are, what story you're telling, and who you are as a writer. The most important details I found are the ones that are most important to the people you're talking to. So often the easiest thing in the world is to say to someone you're interviewing, what is the most important thing about this story? And often they have the best answer.
Well, I think just one comment on that, because it reminded me of something, Jervette, and this is important to you. Guess what? Once we have our Black Studies Department again, as Jervette will be doing, then we'll be able to do all of that in a wide and expansive, because that's what Black Studies is. It really is preserving our history, ensuring that those stories will never ever go away. So make sure, like advertising, make sure you get behind us. We need this Black Studies Department. By the way, that was one of the demands. It went away. You know, now it's back. Praise the Lord. You know, so all we're saying is that that's the place. Yes, the paper, but imagine when you're talking about able to come together as a department and every little bit of those corners and every area. You know, we don't just have to celebrate Langston one day out of the year. We celebrate him all year round. You know, so I just wanted to put that pitch in, Jervette, to say that we are glad you're here. We're grateful for this upcoming Black Studies Department. Madam Chair.
Oh, thank you, Charles. I appreciate that. And we are out of time, so to follow in your illustrious footsteps, as we're out of time, instead of 5 demands, I'm going to give you 10 to double it as we wrap up. So I want to thank our panelists, Rich, Barbara, Rhiannon, Charles, Greg, Albert. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for being here. I appreciate you. So that's demand 1. Make sure you thank them also. Number 2, I want to thank all of the paper contributors, past and present. They have done so much for CCNY, for CUNY, for Harlem. And if you look at page 7 in your program, you can thank them by contributing to the scholarship for the paper. And we hope that you will do so. I know that Al in particular will hope that you will do so. So please do that. Number 3, thank you to CCNY, to CUNY for contributing to make sure that we could do this today. So thank you to them. Number 4, make sure you thank the Provost and the Dean of the Humanities for contributing to make sure that we could do this today, for funding to make sure that this could happen. Make sure you thank them so that we can do it next year for number 46. They're right there. So make sure that you thank them for that. Number 5, MCA, the Media and Communication Arts Department. I want to thank them. CLA, the College Language Association, and MLA, the Modern Language Association. That helps me do what I do so that we could be here today. I want to make sure we thank them. Number 6, Black Studies and the Langston Hughes Advisory Committee. Thank you all for all of your work to make sure that this happens. 7, Aaron Davis, this place right here. We could not do this if we weren't in here. So thank you to all of the staff that made this happen. And number 8, Aaron, to the 5 Demands film. Andrea, wave your hands right there at 2 o'clock. We'll be back in this space to see the 5 Demands film. We hope that you'll stick around and see that film so that you'll see Mr. Charles Powell again in all of his glory with all of his hair. So you want to come back so that you can see that. And then number 9, of course, I know that's what a lot of you are here for and will be back here for at 6 p.m., our ceremony honoring Colson Whitehead. That is, of course, the big to-do. And we will also have the Memphis Ambassador of Music, my hometown, Ariel Rain, will be here to perform, and we'll hope that you'll join us for that. And then, last but not least, the reestablishment of the Black Studies Department here at CCNY. It's the reason why I chose to come here. It is a legacy that I believe in. For almost 30 years, we have not had a Black Studies Department at the flagship of the CUNY system. And I am here committed to make sure that we have one again. And I hope that you will join me in making sure that happens. And if you look on page 11 of your program, there is another QR code. And I hope that you will contribute to the scholarship for Black Studies here. In addition to that, we don't have a QR code for this yet, but we will have one soon. It is for the General Operating Fund for Black Studies. I need money to make sure that Black Studies can exist. If you want to donate to Black Studies in general, you just gotta find me. I promise you I will find a way for you to donate to Black Studies. We are going to have Black Studies as a department here again. I believe that we can make that happen. I know that you believe we can make that happen. We hope that you'll join with us. And it is not a demand, but I know that you will believe in it anyway. There's food outside. Please go out there, have some, come back in here without your food, because all the Aaron Davis people will not be happy if you come in here with your food, but eat it out there. 2 o'clock, film in here, 6 o'clock, Colson, Whitehead. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you. Have a great day.